Thank you, sir.
Good evening. We have concluded our studies in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. But at the end of 2nd Kings, we find that Judah is in captivity in Babylon. And so we are going to now go into a study of Israel, Judah, in Babylon, in captivity, and an eventual return to the Promised Land. We're going to examine the 70-year history of what happened there in that place called Babylon, just outside of modern-day Baghdad, a city that for many years skeptics said proved that the Bible wasn't true because nobody could find it. But Babylon has been discovered. It's known where it is. Like Nineveh, skeptics have said it proved that the Bible wasn't true, but it is true. These places are real. And so we're going to begin with the book of Daniel. Daniel tells us about the history of Judah in Babylon. And then we're going to go beyond the lifetime of Daniel, beyond the lifetime of Nebuchadnezzar, and we're going to study the book of Esther, a study of Judah well established inside of Babylon, but before they were released to go back. And then we're going to finally study the books of Ezra and Nehemiah as the people return to the land of promise. And so we're going to begin tonight with the book of Daniel, but we're going to begin in a different kind of way. We're going to talk about who is this man, Daniel. How did he get to be where he was? And who was Daniel? Where was he? How did he get where he went? And where he went was like Joseph of old in Egypt, who through great distress was elevated by God to become the second most powerful man in the kingdom. That's who Daniel became. If we look at his life, we can see him rise from the shackles of slavery to become the prime minister of Babylon. Now that's mathematically impossible. But with God, all things are possible. And Daniel was a man of extraordinary character. He was a man of extraordinary faith, and he was a man of extraordinary patience and focus. And we know this, why? Because in the book of Daniel, the king issues an edict to seek out men like Daniel from the captives that he has just received from the conquest of Jerusalem. So, the king of Babylon is looking for men like Daniel, and he finds them. Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, that is the land of Babylon, modern-day Iraq, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youth without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. It's the first 4 verses of the book of Daniel. And this is the situation. It is not good. Now we may just read through this glibly, but this is no glib reading if you were living in that time. Because Nebuchadnezzar was the most brutal man of his time. He was efficient in the art of warfare and conquest like none before him. Nebuchadnezzar was a general in charge of the armies before he was king. He was the son of the king, but he was such a talented military man that the king put his son in charge of the conquest. Now, he didn't just conquer just anyone. Babylon began as a province inside the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians, based out of Nineveh, had conquered the entire known world except for Egypt. And they dominated this part of the world with a violence and terror that the world had never seen. It was the Assyrians that had swept the 10 tribes of Israel into oblivion. It was the Assyrians that conquered everybody around them. And Babylon was part of that conquest. But as years went by, the Babylonians became restless. And they rebelled against Assyria and gained their independence. But the warfare and the conquest in the minds of Babylon was not to be put down. And so the Babylonians, it was the desire of their heart to punish and, yes, eradicate their enemy Assyria. And they began to create wars and conflict with Assyria, and little by little, Assyria began to fall apart. And Assyria knew that she was in dire straits, so in order to survive, in order to fight back against Babylon, she formed an alliance with Egypt. And Egypt and Assyria fought the Babylonians at a 4-year battle called Carchemish. And after that battle, Assyria was destroyed. And Egypt was brought to her knees, never to rise again. And all the nations that had been conquered by Assyria now flowed to the hand of Babylon. And this was done mainly at the hand of this man Nebuchadnezzar, who fought on behalf of his father. And when his father died, he became king. And so we are seeing now how he's going to rule with his newfound conquest. Now, the Assyrians had a theory that was far more brutal than the Babylonians. The Assyrians decided they were going to destroy their enemies, never to rise again. And they did this by mixing the peoples in a great pot, as it were. And that's how the Samaritans came to be in Israel, for example. The people of Israel that were left there, they took people from other conquered areas, pagans, moved them into Israel, mixed up the culture to where it was neither pagan nor Israeli any longer, couldn't even be recognized from its former self. And so Israel, not only religiously, but bloodline-wise, politically and every other way, was eradicated. That was what the Assyrians did. Well, this caused great hatred among those to whom this was done, and it ultimately was their demise. But the Babylonians were far more pragmatic than the Assyrians. Their approach was to come into a country and to Babylonianize the leadership, and therefore to Babylonianize the people eventually. They didn't want to punish their conquered people. They wanted them to become one of them. And this was what they did. But the process was brutal, because the process required the removal of people from their homeland to go to Babylon and train to become Babylonians. And that is what is happening here. Now, Daniel is a member of the nobility. He's no peasant. He's way up there in the hierarchy of Judah. But he, like everybody else, is now under the boot of Nebuchadnezzar. And the king has issued this decree that the best and the brightest of Judah be brought to Babylon for re-education. You may recall during the years of communism, the communists would have what they called re-education camps. If you were a free thinker, or even more than that, a free speaker, then you would be taken to a re-education camp to where they would use any and every tactic to make you one of them, to silence you and to suppress you. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And it's very instructive in verse 3 that the king instructs not just anyone to complete this task. He asked his chief eunuch, Ashpenaz, to do this. Now, the text does not come out and say that Daniel and his companions were eunuchs, but their master was the chief of the eunuchs. It's very unlikely that Daniel remained as he was born. In all likelihood, he was a eunuch, as was everybody else in this party of Jewish leaders who were brought to Babylon. So they were humiliated by being defeated. Their friends and their family were killed or captured. They were brought in chains to Babylon. And then once in Babylon, they were put under great distress to be able to survive and be chosen to wait on the king and to do things for the king. And so we're going to examine some of that later. But the point of our lesson tonight is to look at the job description that King Nebuchadnezzar called for these youths to have. And we're going to look at this job description, and we are going to know that the fact that Daniel was chosen along with his 3 companions, that his resume fulfilled the job description. That's how people obtain employment. Now, this is a very tough way to get a job, but it was the only way that was at his disposal. And so the job description goes out, the resume fits, and so Daniel and his companions are going to be hired. So we want tonight to look at the job description and, yes, the resume of this man Daniel. And we're going to discover that this man Daniel had a resume that just wouldn't quit. Daniel, as we know, turned out to be one of God's mighty men in all the Bible. He is in a class with very few other people. He's in the class with Abraham. He's in the class with Joseph. He's in the class with David. He's in the class with John the Baptist. These are pivotal people in God's plan. People without whom, who knows what would have happened. But we don't have to speculate about the ifs, because we know that these men stood in the gap at the time that they lived and had been chosen by God. And so when Daniel steps up to the plate, he steps up with qualifications that are extraordinary by those standards of that day and by our standards today. And so we want to examine these standards that he had to have. These were not this was not a wish list by the king. This was a demand of the chief of the eunuchs. You find me men like this, and you bring them to Babylon, and I'm going to turn them into Babylonians. That's what we read about in verse 4. That's what this is all about. Why does he want to bring them to Babylon? So they can teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The literature and the Chaldeans, he wants to infuse in these men the culture of Babylon and to teach them the language. And Nebuchadnezzar was so successful at this venture, that most Jews, when 70 years later were given the opportunity to go back to the land of their fathers, refused to do so. As a result, many of the Iranians today are just as Jewish as they are Arab. Now, they would never admit to that. But we won't say all because we know it wasn't the case, but many, if not most of the Jews stayed in Babylon. And they intermarried and intermixed with the Babylonian society as a whole. Now, how successful was Nebuchadnezzar in this venture? He was so successful that when the people returned 70 years later, they could not speak or understand or write Hebrew. They spoke and they wrote and understood the language of the Babylonians, Aramaic. And it stuck. Even in the time of Christ, the language of Judea was Aramaic. It wasn't Hebrew. Now the rabbis and the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the well-educated, could write and understand Hebrew, but that was for the temple, that was for the synagogue, but the everyday language of the people was still the language of Babylon. That's how successful Nebuchadnezzar was. In fact, no one from the time of the Babylonian captivity until actually in recent years in our lifetime have people actually used Hebrew as a spoken language. The Israelis have forced themselves to reintroduce Hebrew in their culture as a spoken and written language for the first time since the Babylonian captivity. And so Nebuchadnezzar was extremely successful, and he was extremely successful because he chose men like Daniel. Now, we want to read the job description and then discuss it. These men of the royal family and of the nobility of the people needed to be, according to verse 4, youths without blemish. He wanted young men, not old men, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. These qualities that the king demanded of these men would enable them to do three things. They would enable them, these former Jewish leaders, these former men of the royal house of Judah, this training was going to enable them to stand before the king himself in the palace at Babylon and give him wisdom and give him instruction. And they were going to do that because they were going to learn and learn and learn and learn the language of the Chaldeans and its literature. The literature of Babylon was the culture and the philosophy of this great pagan monolith called Babylon. Babylon in the Bible is always a kind of satanic kingdom. Babylon in the book of Revelation is used metaphorically to represent all that which opposes the Christ. And Daniel not only was in Babylon, he controlled Babylon. You see, the king Nebuchadnezzar thought he was in control, but God was in control, And he was in control through Daniel. And through Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar is going to go on a spiritual journey that we'll examine, that will take him from the most pagan of pagans to becoming a believer in the one true God of Daniel. Now that is a long journey. But Nebuchadnezzar made it because he realized at the end of the day there is only one God and no one has any power except through him. And so this resume, this job description, we want to examine the facets of it. We're going to look at how the words are rendered in the English Standard Version and see how they're rendered in the King James Version for comparison. The first characteristic of the job description and the first item, bullet point if you please, on Daniel's resume was that he was without blemish. Both the English Standard and the King James use this word, without blemish. It's from the Hebrew word mum, M-U-M, and it means without stain. And it means not only without stain, but without stain either physical or moral. There's no physical or moral spot or blot on his body or on his character. That is the first part of the job description and the first bullet point on Daniel's resume. He was said to be, secondly, of good appearance in the ESV, but the King James says well-favored, and it's from the Hebrew word tov, T-O-B-E. And what this means is that Daniel was, and the job description said he had to be, a good man. One who was beautiful. He had wonderful appearance. He was a handsome man. He was the best among his peers. He was bountiful in his character. He was favored by his peers. He was considered to be fine, like fine food. And he was merry. This word means, tov means to be merry. Now this is interesting and very, very instructive for us. Because we live in times where we tend to be kind of depressed as Christians. We see fewer and fewer and fewer people following Christ. And more and more and more people waxing more wicked all the time. And we have this tendency to become dour and down and depressed. But in Nebuchadnezzar's job description and Daniel's bullet point resume, he was a merry man. He was a happy man. He was joyful. He was pleasant. He was a sweet man. He was well favored. The next job description and bullet point on Daniel's resume was that he was skillful. The King James and the New American, the English Standard used the word skillful. Both used the word skillful. This is from the Hebrew word sakal. And it means to be intelligent. It means to be expert at what you do. It means to be prudent. It means to be successful. It means that you are a teacher, that you are wise and you are self-controlled. Self-controlled. It was so important to King Nebuchadnezzar. And it was so important to Daniel. And it should be so important to us. But we don't live in a time of self-control. Self-control is not valued in our society. It's scoffed at. But if we're going to be Christians, we are to be self-controlled. And this word skillful also means to be considerate. Considerate of other people. Now this is really extraordinary because these are characteristics that Daniel displayed in conquest and in captivity and humiliation. It's easy to be these things when things are going good. But when you are conquered, and you are enslaved, and you are humiliated, and you are alone, it's very, very difficult to be this way. But Daniel was this way. He never wavered. Daniel was one of those few people in the Bible that nothing bad is said about. Now, we all know that he was a sinner. We're all sinners and fall short of the glory of God. Daniel was a sinner. But we never read anything negative about him. Why? Because he was one of God's extraordinary people. He was like Joseph. Now, the next item on the king's job description and the next bullet point on Daniel's resume, he had to be a man of wisdom. These young men had to be men of wisdom. It's from the Hebrew word chokmah. And it's very interesting description of this word and definition. And one of the things we have to really get a hold of when we're doing word studies in the Bible is that words don't necessarily mean today what they meant in earlier times. Wisdom in the Hebrew means to be skillful and witty. To be a wise person is the one who can be skillful and witty while being skillful. An interesting combination. There's that merriment thing again. Daniel had to be a man who was merry and witty. This was considered by the king to be important. And Daniel was this man. Now, the next word that is very interesting, and it probably illustrates more than any of the other words how over time definitions can change. How many of you, let's raise your hands, how many of you have a favorable impression when you hear the word cunning? Is this a good or a bad thing to have on your resume today? Are you going to put cunning on your resume? Yeah. That's what it means today. But in the olden times, it didn't necessarily mean that. The word is rendered cunning in the King James, skillful in the English Standard Version. It comes from the Hebrew word yada, Y-A-D-A. In cunning, in the biblical sense, in the job description sense of Nebuchadnezzar, and in the bullet point sense of Daniel's resume, cunning meant to be observative, caring, aware, comprehensive, instructive, giving, friendly, perceptive, respectful, sure, understanding, intuitive, a listener, and comprehensive. That's what cunning means in the old sense of the word. Doesn't mean that today, and we probably should never use that word because it just is negative in our time. But in earlier times, it was a very, very admired quality. Skillful or cunning. The next item on the job description that Nebuchadnezzar posted and the resume that Daniel had, and both the King James and the English Standard use the word knowledge to describe it. It's from the Hebrew word da'af. And we think of knowledge as something you learn from a book. But in the biblical sense, in the Hebrew, this word da'af means to be keenly aware. The king wanted someone who would be keenly aware of his surroundings, keenly aware of those with whom he had to deal, keenly aware of the day's events, keenly aware of anything and everything he had to be a man who was keenly aware, a man of knowledge, and so he was. The next quality on Nebuchadnezzar's job description in Daniel's bullet point resume, both the King James and the ESV use the word understanding. And this word rendered understanding comes from the Hebrew word biyin, B-I-Y-N. And this is a key word. A key word because it means essentially to be able to mentally separate the good and the bad. To mentally separate the important and the unimportant. To mentally separate priorities from the frivolous. He was to be able to mentally separate or distinguish. He was to be a man of understanding, an attentive man, a diligent man, a direct man, eloquent, informative, intelligent, admirable, prudent, regarded, skillful, thinking, and reflective. To be a very serious-minded person, this man who would meet the job description of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, whose resume fulfilled these things. The next item on the job description is rendered science in the King James and learning in the English Standard Version. It's from, I'm sorry? The first rendering is science in the King James. Science. Yes, science. And the ESV renders it learning. It's from the Hebrew word madah. M-A-D-D-A-H. And this word science or learning means that the man is to be intelligent, conscious, aware, observable, a thinker. A thinker. Now, in our day and time, thinking has been discounted seriously. You take a student in school who does a lot of thinking, more likely than not, the teacher's going to write home that Johnny is daydreaming. Johnny may or may not be daydreaming. He may be thinking. Thinking is a very good thing. Our society, we react without thinking. And we see the ruins of lives everywhere because people have quit thinking. They just react like so many silver balls in a parlor game at a restaurant. I can't think of the pinball. People are just so many pinballs these days. No one sits down and thinks about anything. No one contemplates their present or their future. But the man who was going to fill the job description of the king was going to be a thinker. He is going to be a scientist and one involved in learning. Now, this completes the resume. This completes the job description. The two mesh. Nebuchadnezzar's impossible job description comes to reality in the impossible resume of this man, Daniel. And why is that? The King James says that the end of the job description ends with the term "and such." Now we might look at that and think, etc., etc. But the English version, English Standard Version, translates that competent. It's from the Hebrew word asher, and it means in order that. In order that. Asher, A-S-H-E-R. And such in the King James, competent in the English Standard. Competent. And in order that what? In order that this man, chosen by the king ultimately, would be a man who would be able to stand in the very presence of the king. Now that was something that was nearly impossible. Because as we read in the book of Esther, you couldn't stand before the king unless you were invited. And if invited, you better have something to say that's going to help and to benefit the king. Because if you don't or cannot, you may be dead tomorrow. You see, those who stood before King Nebuchadnezzar literally took their life in their own hand when they went before the king. Because if they were unable to contribute to the king's well-being, they might not ever have another chance before the king, because in all likelihood, they would not be alive. The king was not going to tolerate a person who claimed on their resume to have a job description that the king wanted and then not to be able to perform. What does all this mean to us? It means that in our life circumstances that are brutal and difficult and seemingly impossible to deal with, God is calling us, as He called Daniel, to be people without stain, people without moral deficiency. He's calling us to be people of a merry spirit. He's calling us to be people who are self-controlled. He's calling us to be skillful people. He's calling us to be respectful people. He's calling us to be keenly aware of those things around us. And He's calling us to be able to mentally separate truth from error, and to be eloquent in communicating that truth to the world. We are to be thinkers, not reactors, thinkers. That our actions and our duties, our work, is to be very methodical, because we're going to think it out before we do what we're going to do. Because we stand, as it were, in the court of a king far greater than Nebuchadnezzar. You and I are servants of Jesus Christ. He has put out a job description. And we have put out a resume that says, yes, Jesus Christ, I will do as you've told me to do. I will be a faithful servant, and I will serve you, and I will be of benefit to you. That's why this is so important. We should look at Daniel not as a historical figure, though he is. We should not sit back and admire what he accomplished, though we should. We should look at Daniel as a role model. How can I become like him? Through Jesus Christ. You see, it's not possible to become Daniel without Jesus. Without Jesus, first of all, we're not going to be motivated to do these things. And without Jesus, we could not do it on our own without help. But with Jesus, our resume can be built and built and built and built. And over time, in a very spiritual way, through Jesus Christ, we can accomplish things that Daniel accomplished in a physical way. Through this course of study, that is our goal, to become more like Daniel through the power of Jesus Christ. When we leave this world, may it be said of all of us that we were without stain, that we were happy people, we were self-controlled, we were skillful, we were respectful of others, that we were keenly aware of our surroundings, and we were able to differentiate good from evil and to communicate that good to others. That's what Daniel did. That's what we're called to do. Tonight, if you're here, and I believe all of us here are Christians in the New Testament sense of the word, but if you're here and you've wandered away from the standard of God's calling, you can be restored through repentance and prayer. Won't you come as we stand to sing to encourage you?
Unto Jesus He